But you know what I wanted to do? I really wanted to talk about a guy named Maurice of Nassau. So I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about this guy named Maurice of Nassau. Just out of curiosity, before I tell the story of Maurice of Nassau, does anybody know where Nassau is, just out of curiosity? He's this Dutch general from the Dutch Wars of Independence. And why Maurice of Nassau is so interesting, that's the guy's name, if you're curious. Oh, Italy, yeah, not a bad guess, not a bad guess. But Maurice of Nassau is really interesting because he is a general, and he is one of the figures behind something we call the military revolution, what some historians call the military revolution. And that is the professionalization of military forces in Europe between the 1500s into the 1600s, and the kind of knock-on effects that come with that. So think about it like this. Everybody knows where gunpowder came from, right? The very specific chemical composition that makes gunpowder. We all know where that's from, correct? This is fairly common knowledge. We get gunpowder from China, ancient China specifically, right? We got some monks who are looking for the elixir of immortality. They're mixing up various minerals, and one day by accident they just happen to put together the right combination of chemicals, and it happens to produce a little explosion, a little pop, and we get gunpowder. Woohoo! Explosion. How do we go from that to like, I don't know, M4s? It was a super long process, but when gunpowder finally made its way over to Europe, it found itself in a place where there was lots of tiny wars going on all the time. Like, just European states and princes were fighting all the time. If you've ever studied any European history, you know this, that the princes of Europe were constantly bickering and squabbling and fighting one another. And so with gunpowder, they thought, all right, we can use this to kind of get an edge on our rivals. And so gunpowder is initially used kind of in something called a hand cannon. So it's like a little, if you think about just a little stone or metal tube that you put on the end of a stick, and then you light it on fire. You stuff some gunpowder in there, you just light it on fire, and maybe you put like a little flaming arrow in there. Gunsmiths created little barrels, and eventually we start to see something that resembles the gun we understand today. But the thing about guns is they are expensive, right? They cost a lot of money to make, relatively speaking, back in the day when you had to make every single one by hand, and there was no such thing as interchangeable parts, which is how we make pretty much everything today. So back in the day, it was expensive, and so in order to, for example, if you want to be a prince that has a large military, you're going to need to collect taxes that allow you to have this large military. And so the thing about the military revolution is that it basically means that in order to get more guns, which is what a lot of the princes wanted, you had to tax your people more, and which meant you had to have a more efficient tax collection system, and it meant that you had to have more bureaucrats to collect your taxes. And essentially the argument is that firearms created the modern state in Europe, which would then take the nation-state concept and export it to the rest of the world. TLDR is that the argument could be made that guns created the modern world. Now you might be wondering, where does this Maurice of Nassau guy come from? Like, where does this Maurice of Nassau guy come from? Well, Maurice of Nassau is the guy that made firearms really appealing because he showed that you could use them really effectively. And he is fighting the Spanish. He's one of the princes, what's called a stadtholder, of the region. Now, the Netherlands, as we know them at the time, were a bunch of different states, but they were all fighting the Spanish for their independence. Spain had ruled them for a couple hundred years. They'd married into the region, and so they were fighting Spain for their independence. Now, Spain at the time was one of the most powerful countries in the world because it happened to have a ton of wealth that it was getting from its New World colonies in the what's now the South America and parts of the Caribbean. And so to go head-to-head with Spain was no small task for the little Dutch Republic. And so Maurice of Nassau, he decided that he needed to make sure that the Dutch military was up to the task. And in order to make sure that their army was effective and reliable, he actually, instead of coming up with something new, he went back in time and he came up with, he found this old Roman military manual, like Rome from Roman Empire. So we're talking like 1,000 years prior to when he himself was alive. And he finds this old Roman military manual. I think it's called Vegetus. I think it's called Vegetus. And he basically sort of internalizes a lot of its lessons. And basically it really stressed the idea of... It stressed this idea of training, like really disciplining soldiers. And more than that, it stressed this idea of creating a plan and a drill that you could drill your soldiers on in order that they would know how to use a firearm effectively. And it wouldn't be this chaotic mess of everybody trying to reload their gun at a different time, everybody trying to clean and ready their weapon at a different time. This question of like quality, like is your particular group of soldiers trained to use weapons or are they not? He basically developed a series of drills, and he made it almost like a 12-step program, except in this case it was literally 12 steps that soldiers could follow that showed them how to steady, aim, and fire their weapon, and then reload it. And he just drilled his soldiers all day, all the time, until they all understood how to load their rifles effectively. And the reason why this was important was because the Spanish in Europe, they had a military formation, and it's something called a in the Spanish, I think it comes from Latin, it's called a tercio, and it's like a gigantic square. Basically it's a gigantic square of pikemen, dudes with really long pokey sticks, and they would all be in the center of this square. And inside the square there would be guys with swords that could jump out and attack anybody that got too close. And on the sides of the pikemen, on the sides of the guys with the long pokey sticks, there were little mini squares. So if you think of like a square with 4 squares on the corner. And so this particular formation was incredibly effective in helping Spain hold on to its European territories. It gave the Dutch an incredibly hard time, because in order to counter the tercio, the only effective way of doing it for a really long time was you just had to have a lot of cannons that you could like just blast the tercio from a distance before it got too close to you. But even then, that wasn't always guaranteed to work. So it was really tough to counter this very particular fighting formation that the Spanish used. But Maurice of Nassau, by drilling all of his soldiers, he came up with a way to beat the tercio, and that was what we call volley fire. And the idea is pretty simple. It just says everybody's going to fire at the same time, and everyone's going to fire in the same direction. And yeah, that's the way you counter the tercio. Because you got to remember that early firearms are super inaccurate. We're talking literally about like a steel tube with some metal in it. We're not talking about like the finely crafted barrels that we're used to seeing on today's firearms. We're talking about like every single firearm being made by someone different. Therefore, your quality, to put it mildly, your results may vary. So this idea of being able to have everybody fire at the same time was super important. And that, in the end, is how Maurice of Nassau manages to counter this Spanish juggernaut known as the tercio, is by training all of his soldiers to fire at the exact same time. That's one of the ways he's able to sort of defeat the Spanish on the field of battle, with this fancy practice of having everybody fire at the same time. Yeah, that's why Maurice of Nassau is super important to this concept of the military revolution, because he makes this idea of using a solely firearm-based force practical, right? The Spanish tercio had a big component of pikemen, but Maurice of Nassau says, no, as long as you train your soldiers well enough. So, in terms of the military revolution, this idea of guns being the impetus for states to organize, he played a very important part in this whole process. So yeah, that's the military revolution. Now, hopefully, I'm not going to just get absolutely annihilated in this game.